What if I told you that the key to mastering your nutrition and your life isn't about willpower or restriction, but about flexibility? Today, we're going to do a deep dive on why flexible dieting is a skill that every man needs to know and how it will transform your body, your mindset, and your habits. Welcome to the Lean and Lethal podcast, where we help real men build strength, discipline, and growth in every area of life. I'm Deaton, fitness coach, entrepreneur, and your guide to becoming a leaner, stronger, and more lethal version of yourself. Today, we will discuss why previous dieting methods may have left you frustrated and hopeless, and why restraint isn't the problem, how to use structure to create flexibility, and the concept of diet periodization for both fat loss and muscle gain in order to achieve optimal results. That being said, first off, the first thing we need to discuss is what is flexible dieting. Now, oftentimes you'll hear flexible dieting referred to as calorie counting or if it fits your macros. However, the origins of it aren't just based on if it fits your macros. The origins are actually based off of more of the mindset around dieting itself. So as the name implies, it's taking a more flexible approach to your dieting versus a more rigid approach. But flexible dieting is a nutrition strategy that focuses on hitting daily macronutrient targets, so your proteins, fats, and carbs, rather than just restricting entire food groups altogether. At the same time, though, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to be 100% to the gram on each of those macronutrients, or we aren't actually following the diet. So focusing on the mindset with a flexible dieting strategy, we're focusing on key principles and guidelines that are ultimately going to get you to your end goal over a period of time. So we're emphasizing long-term habits as well as actually building that skill around nutrition that so many people lack. I think when we think in terms of skills or knowledge, financial knowledge, everybody understands they need to have basic financial understanding in order to survive in the world. I think the same thing applies to nutrition. Everybody needs a basic mindset around nutrition, and so many people put off gaining that skill or learning that skill and bounce around between fad diet in this yo-yo dieting culture. They get frustrated. They aren't happy. They get anxiety around food. Social media these days, there's somebody out there demonizing just about every single food, and it's created a lot of problems, I think, for our society. So understanding the actual skill behind flexible dieting and some basic nutrition principles is going to be how you're going to ultimately take control of your life. So with that being said, let's look at kind of a comparison between a flexible mindset with dieting and a rigid mindset with dieting. And now people, when they kind of look to demonize calorie counting or if it fits your macros, they'll often go to the extreme and point out the fact that there's no kind of aspect about food quality in there. And yeah, you can do that with any sorts of diet. Nowadays, they have all these keto ice creams, prepackaged goods, treats, cookies. The same thing can happen with keto as it can with a flexible dieting strategy. But we still want to pay attention to the quality of our food for sure. But that isn't the end all be all, as we'll get to here in a second with the pyramid of kind of importance in priorities. So when we compare a rigid mindset versus a flexible mindset when it comes to dieting, first off, I used to think that being more rigid would give you better and quicker results. When I kind of first got into the whole realm of nutrition and training in terms of changing your body composition, whether that's building muscle or losing fat, I got into it in very heavily in like the bodybuilding space and looking at it from that perspective of things. And there's a lot to take from bodybuilders. Their job is to lose muscle or lose fat and build muscle as quickly and efficiently as possible. So there's a lot that we can take from there. But a lot of people think that you need to be as strict as a bodybuilder in order to see results. And that the more rigid, the more strict you are, the better results you'll get. And when I first started working with a coach back in, I believe it was about 2020 or so, I ate the same exact foods, the same meal plan every single day for about an entire year. The only thing that changed was the portion sizes, the amount of rice in my meals. Maybe during different phases, one food would get added in or removed, but largely it was the exact same, very bland foods. It was rice, peas, and chicken. It was rice cakes with tuna on top. It was Greek yogurt in the morning with some oatmeal. Very, very, very basic foods. And that doesn't need to be the case. And you'll see in the long term, there's a lot of negative correlations that happen with having more rigidity in your diet. So there's been a lot of research done on more rigid diets versus having more flexible diets too. And some things that they found that more rigid diets were correlated with were, first, less weight loss in general during the dieting phase and less weight loss maintained. So obviously, the more strict we are with our diet, the more unsustainable it's going to be, and the more likely we are to, when we get off the diet, just go back to our old eating habits and regain a lot of that weight that we lost. There was also a lot higher focus on food. That basically means when you have these very strict rules in place that cut out certain food groups that allow you to not eat certain foods, most of us are going to think about those foods a lot more because of those rules that were put in place. Think about any rule. When somebody tells you not to do something, oftentimes that incentivizes you or pushes you to want to do that thing a little bit more just because that rule was put in place and somebody else told you that you couldn't do it. Also, rigidity is more correlated with overeating, more frequent binge eating, more severe binge eating, higher levels of depression and anxiety, a worse off or a more poor body image or self-esteem when it comes to body composition. And while correlation does not always mean causation, correlation means that all of these things I just spoke about are found alongside with more rigid diets, but it does not mean that rigid diets are 100% causing all these things. So how do we figure out if these are also in that causation category as well as the correlation? Through research in different studies. So a randomized control trial is a study where basically they're eliminating a lot of the external variables, and the participants are randomized into two different groups so that they can be compared based off of the variables that they are looking at. So there was a study done back in 2012 where they looked at two different groups that were doing the exact same diet, except one of the group was not allowed to have bread and the other group was allowed to have bread. So they're looking at the rigidity versus more flexible approach to dieting. One group simply was not able to have one food that is sometimes in these stricter, more rigid diets, commonly kind of categorized as a bad food. Bread is. They weren't allowed to have bread. And what did we find throughout this study? At the 12-week mark, there was significantly more slip-ups on their diet, meaning times that they went over their calories or kind of broke their dieting pattern and made some sort of error or slip-up in that 12-week period with the group that was not allowed to have bread compared to the group that was allowed to have bread. So the group that was allowed to have bread was a lot more consistent, had a fewer slip-ups during that 12-week period. And this study supports the correlations that were previously mentioned with a more rigid diet, causing less weight loss during the diet, less weight loss maintained, because if you're constantly slipping up, you're not going to see as good of results. More focus on food. These people were thinking about food more often because they were told that they couldn't have a certain food, and so on with those correlations we talked about with rigidity there. So flexible dieting isn't just about kind of what you eat and thinking that if it fits your macros and you can eat whatever you want, as long as it fits within your macros, It's also about how you think about your food and your goals in order to get those best results as far as muscle mass retention and fat loss with the lowest amount of stress. So why flexible dieting now? Why is this a better option? We know that rigidity versus a more flexible mindset with dieting, we want that more flexible mindset because we're going to be a lot more likely to stick to the diet. But what is the problem now that we need to address? Now, a lot of people think that, like I talked about before, that restraint is the problem. But we know that restrictive diets often lead to a larger focus on food, which leads to more cravings, more binging, an unhealthy relationship with food. If you tell yourself you can't have pizza, it only makes you want to have more of that. And we also know that lack of willpower or restraint isn't the issue, as we understand that in order to get any sorts of results with a diet, we're going to need to have some level of restraint in order to control ourselves around food. That's a big part of this too, is just simply the self-control aspect. But there are ways that just simply based off of psychology and what we know about kind of human tendencies, that you're going to set yourself up for a lot better success in the long term using a less rigid approach. So as far as kind of creating the structure with flexibility, I would say there's a few things we want to focus on. So first is going to be priorities. The second is going to be using ranges and continuums in order to give ourselves guidelines versus rules so that we can actually, one, see the diet through longer in order to get better results, two, be less miserable, three, be able to have a skill that when we're in various different situations, we have a skill where we can actually think about food in a manner that is based off of these guidelines and principles that we've learned versus using simply black and white viewpoints to view food. So we want to be able to critically think about our nutrition, as almost everything exists on this scale of everything exists on a continuum. So it's not just a black and white, and having that structure is what will actually give you some sort of flexibility, because everybody wants flexibility. Everybody hates restricting themselves. Everybody hates getting into a diet or a fat loss phase because they don't want to restrict themselves because they know they have some sort of life event coming up, parties, whatever that may be. And 100%, that is life. So we need to know how we can critically think about food and nutrition to navigate all of these different life events that come up, because there's never going to be a point in time where you have 6 months to a year where nothing out of the ordinary day-to-day is going on, and you're going to be able to stick to these strict diets without ever breaking a lot of these rules. And I've had a lot of clients that come in too, and they're like, I want a meal plan, tell me exactly what to eat, because they think that rigidity is going to give them quicker results. And you quickly notice that after about a week or a week and a half, they're already burnt out or sick of the meal plan, and they want you to change up the meal plan again. I'm already sick of this. So that's why having very, very strict structure or rules like that, I should say, is just going to lead you to being burnt out. So we actually need to work on developing the skill around nutrition so that we can critically think in these different scenarios. So now when it comes to priorities, we can kind of view this as a pyramid. So on the bottom of the pyramid, these are the more foundational things. And then as we get up to the point of the pyramid, these things are going to have a lot less impact on the results that we see from our diet. So the very baseline foundation of the pyramid is adherence. Because if we can't simply adhere to the nutrition method that we chose, we're not going to be able to see it through. We're not going to be able to get results. So number one is adherence. Number two is going to be energy balance. This simply means in terms of fat loss, we need to be burning more calories on a daily basis than we are consuming. That is what energy balance is. And that is number two, as that will dictate whether you gain or lose or maintain your body weight. Number three is going to be macronutrients. So that is your proteins, your fats, and your carbs. That will dictate whether or not we primarily lose fat or primarily lose muscle or even water weight. So we have adherence as number one. This has to be something that we can adhere to. So it has to be flexible based off of our lifestyle in our life. Number two, we need to make sure we're in an energy deficit with our energy balance. Number three, we need to have proper portions of macronutrients. Primarily, protein is going to be the biggest one in order to make sure that we're retaining our muscle mass and not in just losing fat mass. And also that we're still getting adequate amounts of fat and carbohydrates so that our hormones remain at healthy levels and we aren't jeopardizing our performance or our health in any other way. The next one is going to be micronutrients. So this is where looking at whole foods is a big factor to get most of those micronutrients from. We don't want to have to continuously take 10, 20 different supplements a day just to get these micronutrients in, because all the foods we're eating are processed in prepackaged. So focusing on more whole nutrient dense foods is going to give us more of those micronutrients, which is going to help us have higher energy throughout the day, sleep better, hormone production, good digestive and gut health. All of those are primarily going to come from micronutrients, And the next one is going to be nutrient timing. So this is oftentimes you'll hear people talk about the anabolic window after a workout, getting in that protein within 30 minutes after the workout. And it's definitely not as small as 30 minutes. And depending on who you ask, there's a big debate over this. But at the end of the day, it's not a huge topic of concern, especially as long as you're getting the proper amount of nutrients in throughout the course of the day. If you're hitting your protein target every single day, it doesn't necessarily matter a ton as far as the timing of that. Now, when we work down the scale and get more nuanced, there are slightly more benefits to evenly spacing your protein in throughout the day. And now, first off, it's going to make it a lot easier to get all your protein in throughout the day, but it's not going to play a huge impact on your overall body composition over a period of time. And then the very, very tip of the pyramid, we have supplements, which a lot of people, especially you men, tend to put supplements as the foundation of your pyramid. You're quick to go drop a few $100s a month on whatever these supplements are that I don't know if you think they're going to do the work for you or what, but you're very quick to go spend hundreds, if not even thousands of dollars a month on supplements. They give you that last little 1% edge while you're neglecting the whole foundation of this pyramid, being adherence, then energy balance, then macronutrients, micronutrients, nutrient timing, and supplements being the last and final thing. So with that being said, we know what our priorities are. So when we come into certain circumstances where life gets a little hectic, we're traveling, we have meetings, we don't have a lot of access to food, we can simply work down this scale of priorities to make sure that we're still checking those bottom boxes in order to keep moving the needle forward. So when things get hectic, we shouldn't just be worrying about supplements, as that's that very point of the pyramid. If something needs to go, supplements go first, nutrient timing goes next, then micronutrients, and then still worrying about macronutrients, energy balance, and adherence. And we'll talk about kind of three different three different levels of tracking that you can kind of use in order to kind of create more flexibility in different times here in a minute. But we know what our priorities are. Now we need to use ranges and continuums. So instead of really focusing on hitting super rigid targets where it's like you need to eat 200 grams of protein a day, and if you don't hit 200 grams, you fail, and all else is out the window, and you're not going to be retaining your muscle mass or building muscle mass if you only got 190 grams of protein in per day. So having these continuums in ranges, so plus or minus 5-10 grams of whatever that goal is, let's say it's 200, is plenty enough to establish enough consistency to start seeing results. You're not going to be a difference. There's no statistically significant difference between getting 190 and 200 grams of protein per day. Now, obviously, we want to shoot to be as accurate and as consistent as possible, because there's a lot of error that is built into tracking food labels, that sort of thing. So the more error we can minimize, the better. But at the same time, if we're within a certain range, 100%, we're still moving the needle and we are making progress there. So kind of key takeaways here is we need to be able to critically think about nutrition in context of priorities and a continuum in order to, one, put less stress on us for hitting certain kind of targets or rules, and two, knowing what to prioritize when things get a little hectic. So now, to wrap this up here, we'll talk about diet periodization and then finish it off with the different levels of tracking and some diet and how we can use dieting breaks to, one, make our adherence better to a diet, and then get better results in the long term. So to start with, what is diet periodization? Simply adjusting your calorie and macronutrient intake based on your goals. So whether your goal is to lose fat or build muscle, we can adjust your macronutrients, which equate to your calories, because your macros make up your calories. So when people talk about calorie tracking versus macro tracking, calories is just looking at the energy balance, versus macros get into those different components of your daily calorie consumption. So protein and carbs both have 4 calories per gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram, which we'll get into that here later on down the road. But for today, we're just talking about the benefits of flexible dieting and how that has been shown to be the leading approach for fat loss and muscle gain. So for fat loss, we'll simply figure out what our maintenance calories are and lower them, or drop our calories below our maintenance about 10 to 20% in order to create about a 3,500 calorie per week deficit. So about 3,500 calories is the equivalent of 1 pound of fat. So we need to create a 3,500 calorie deficit per week in order to be losing about a pound of fat, or 1% of our body weight per week. And we want to make sure that we are still eating a high protein diet in order to preserve muscle mass. So muscle gain now is the exact opposite of that. So we want to be about 10 to 20% above our maintenance calories. And a lot of this is going to come through a higher carb intake to fuel your workouts and recovery. You'll see a lot of times protein is going to be relatively the same, whether we are in a fat loss phase or a muscle building phase. And then carbohydrates and fats are going to fluctuate a lot more. Now, fats, we definitely have a minimum for, because they affect our hormone production. But there's not a whole lot of benefit in terms of bringing your fat intake excessively high. So we'll see carb intake is what is going to fluctuate the most between a muscle gain phase and a fat loss phase. Now, the last one is simply our maintenance phase. So the amount of calories it takes to just maintain our body weight. And this is good for giving your body a break from either being in a surplus or from being in a deficit. So giving your body that break to kind of recuperate and reverse some of those TDEE adaptations. So over the course of a period where we are dieting, our body is going to start to adapt to that different amount of calories coming in, whether we're in a deficit or in a surplus. And that's why knowing what your macros and your calorie intake are is crucial, so that we can make adjustments over longer periods of time. Versus when we look at more of those rigid diets, they have one rule: cutting out carbs, only eating meat, where it's like you either follow that one rule or you don't. There's no way to adjust over time and account for these adaptations. But implementing diet breaks can give you a diet both psychologically, or give you a break from the diet psychologically, and increase adherence, which we know is that foundation of the pyramid of our priorities, and can help reverse some of those TDEE adaptations. So a good time to introduce diet breaks is during either a surplus or a deficit phase. Just every 4 to 8 weeks, you can take a week at maintenance, and that's going to preserve more of your lean body mass and also lead to less of a rebound post-diet. And there's been a lot of research done on this, and you're actually just as likely to lose the same amount of fat mass as somebody who continuously diets for, let's say, 16 weeks as somebody who diets for 16 weeks with 1 week at maintenance in the middle. Now, diet periodization, this kind of overarching concept that we just talked about, allows you to cycle between fat loss and muscle gain and maintaining your body weight in order to ensure that long-term progress without being burnt out or your body adapting to these different levels of energy intake that you put on it. So lastly, to wrap it up, I want to talk about kind of how we can have different levels of tracking. We briefly touched on this before, but for different circumstances in life. So 3 different levels that we can have. 75% of the time when we are in our normal day-to-day routine, it is best to track all 3 macros to be the most accurate as far as making sure we're getting enough protein, making sure fats are at a healthy level, and making sure carbs are at an adequate amount. So we don't want to be on strict numbers either, like I mentioned. So plus or minus 5 to 10 grams for each macro is perfect 75% of the time when we're dialed in our routine. Now let's say you're traveling, you have a little bit less control over things are busy, so we can kind of go to that second level where we're not looking at all 3 macros, we're just going to pay attention to protein and calories. Because we know protein is going to be what helps make sure we maintain our muscle mass, and the calories are going to keep us in that deficit or surplus, depending what our goal is, and make sure that we are losing or gaining weight. So we can be between 5 to 10 grams plus or minus on our protein and plus or minus 100 calories. That's going to simplify things a little bit more. And then that third level is going to be just paying attention to calories, being plus or minus 100 or 150 calories. And that should ideally be about 5% of the time for those circumstances. Maybe it's one day you have a wedding or a boat party and you don't really want to have to pay attention to all your macros. You just want to be in the moment a little more. That is one example of how we can keep making progress by using varying levels of tracking. So 75% of the time, paying attention to all macros within 5 to 10 grams plus or minus. 20% of the time, we're just looking at protein and calories to make sure that we are losing body fat and maintaining our muscle mass. And then that last kind of 5% of the time, we're only worried about calories, plus or minus 100 calories or so, to ensure that we're relatively staying in a calorie deficit. So that is our first ever summary of flexible dieting on the first ever Lean and Lethal podcast here. So if flexible dieting is something that you maybe want to learn more about or figure out how you can implement it into your life so that you can take control of your nutrition, once and for all and get out of these kind of fad dieting, yo-yo dieting cycles that leave a lot of guys super frustrated, go ahead and send me a DM on Instagram or leave a comment here on this episode, and we can chat about how we can get you started with some flexible dieting approaches and how you can start building that lifelong skill that is 100% necessary to be able to control or to be in control of your health and your fitness. But thanks for listening to the first ever episode of the Lean and Lethal podcast. If you found this helpful, hit subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend who's constantly jumping between diets, can't ever seem to get any results and sustain them. And until next time, stay lean, stay lethal, and keep seeking discomfort. Talk to you soon.